Hey y'all, welcome back. Today we're checking out Britain's email war against pirate radio.
This video is brought to you by Squarespace. If you were driving around London in the 90s, there was a very good chance that if you would turn your radio dial just a few millimeters too much, you would open a portal to an underground, illegal world of pirate radio.
Yes, this one goes out to the boys, to the ravers.
Hi guy, Cool Michael here, keeping you company on your ride home on Smooth Balls Radio. The youth of the day was lapping this up, but the British government noticed that the kids were doing something and they got scared.
The pirates are a menace, and I don't believe at all that the public wouldn't support action to enforce the law.
From spying to drug networks, murders and bombings, today we will tell the story of the Great British War against pirate radio.
The illegal stations Radio Nova and Kiss FM have been closed down.
More pirate radio stations broadcasting than ever before.
What they found was a booby-trapped barricade of concrete and razor wire.
What?
Should the pirates be closed down, or should they be legalized?
I've heard about pirate radio somehow. I think in a video I reacted to a long time ago, there was something about like an oil rig out in the ocean or some kind of human-made structure where there was a radio station, but it was in international waters, so the government couldn't do anything about it. Is that what this is? I know the BBC was pretty strict about topics that it covered on the station, and that a lot of songs got banned. They're pretty uptight over there at the BBK, considering that the initials of their organization also stands for Big Black. But y'all, I'm on the side of the pirates. I'm on the side of subverting power. This should be juicy. Oh, be sure to go to Jimmy the Giant and like and subscribe. He does all these great documentaries, y'all.
Ever since radio was invented, it was really used for like military men to talk about serious military things. But over time, a problem would emerge. So just imagine you're Corporal Lancelot, and just as you're about to give the coordinates for where you're meant to bomb, all of a sudden you start to hear something.
Bravo Alpha Charlie 210-786. Hi guys. Barry's weather report here is looking sunny.
A small subculture emerged when soldiers came back from war, called radio hams, and they would get these radios and set them up in like the garden shed or a tent far away from their wife's disapproving looks. And it was a very small, tight-knit community that had radios. It wasn't a popular thing. You didn't just have a radio in your house. But then, in steps the Marconi Company.
Hang on. Y'all, I used to do this when I was a little kid. My dad had a CB radio in his truck, and then he took it out and he put it in our garage, and I would talk to truckers. Huh. They were doing the same thing a long time ago.
In steps the Marconi Company.
Did he invent the radio?
Marconi imagined, what if electromagnetic waves, without the necessity of wires, could carry a long-distance message through the air?
There was a geezer who worked for the Marconi Company, and his name was Peter Eckersley. And so his job was like to test out equipment, see how far he could send out some beeps and boops. But over time, he got kind of bored of doing that, and he started to sing songs and crack jokes over the radio waves. And Bazza and the other radio hams were fucking loving it. The post office, who at the time was supposed to be in control of the airwaves, they heard all this tomfoolery coming.
Did you say the post office was in control of the airwaves? I'm sorry, what?
The post office, who at the time was supposed to be in control of the airwaves, they heard all this tomfoolery coming from Peter, and they got annoyed. And in 1920, the post office banned Peter and his station called 2MT. And immediately, the post office got a ton of complaints. My name is Hugh, and I am alarmed recently that I have not been able to get a hold of Peter's elaborate jokes and zany personality, and I would like to hear him back on the air. Yours truly, Hugh. The overwhelming amount of complaints that came through forced the post office to go, all right, fine, but with one condition. That is that we will regulate the airwaves. And so, it all came back, but it would be under a new name, the BBC.
What? Hang on. The BBC came from the post office? Wow, the BBC was created to fight pirate radio or regulate radio? This actually sounds kind of familiar. I think I reacted to a video about the BBC, and maybe that's where I heard of it. I don't know. I don't remember.
Hello, Marconi Country House, London, calling.
The BBC were the one and only company that were allowed to broadcast on radio. At this time, it's like talk shows, news, maybe a little bit of music, and people were liking it. But then the world changed. Before the 1900s, when you were a kid, you were basically forced up a chimney to go clean it, or thrown down a mine to search for redstone. And the kids would get paid very little, and they would die very often. But if you didn't die...
Really? Hang on, what was that graph? What did that graph say?
And the kids would get...
Infant mortality rate, deaths under 1 year per 1,000 live births, 1930 to 2020. Okay. That's a good graph. That's baby deaths. So we've still got some room to go, but that's a lot of baby death.
But if you didn't die, at some point, you would just be considered an adult. There was no real in-between period. But you see, into the 1900s, there was the introduction of child labor laws, so you couldn't exploit kids to do cheap work. There was also the introduction of free education. And so with this, youth subcultures started to pop up as a way of finding something to do. Whether that's enjoy some new underground music, ride a Vespa, or fundamentally overturn Western values and try and create a utopian society.
So before those child labor laws came about, kids were just like working in a factory. They didn't really have a childhood. But then they got those child labor laws and free education. So these kids are going to school, and after they get out of school, they get bored. They got to do something.
But in amongst the peace-seeking crowd, there were also hawks, aggressors, troublemakers, anarchists. This was how they showed their peaceful intentions against the outnumbered police.
Before we go any further with this video, I want to give a massive shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring. They are...
Y'all be sure to go to Squarespace and buy stuff, you know what I'm saying? Make a website.
Anyway, back to the video. In the 60s, the hippies were rustling some feathers. They were talking about very controversial things like human rights. But on top of the more serious political stuff that the hippies really disliked about British traditional culture, they also really didn't like the radio. Back in those days, the BBC had to operate under a thing called needle time. It's a really stupid law that the music trade unions argued for that reduced the BBC's ability to play music down to 30 hours a week. So bear in mind, this is like the aristocratic, upper-class controlled BBC back in a much more conservative Britain. How much of those 30 hours do you think would be dedicated to people like Elvis Presley, who most of mainstream society considered was the devil because he did this thing with his hips?
Yeah.
When we came along, we started a thing called pirate radio. Although we're not pirates, Caroline has been linked with the word pirate.
In February 1964, an Irishman by the name of Ronan O'Reilly, he purchased a 702-ton ferry. He then proceeded to fit a fuck-off antenna to it, took to the seas, and he created Radio Caroline. So up until now, the youth of the day, they were getting their fix of music either from buying records or tuning into a radio station called Radio Luxembourg. Obviously, as the name suggests, it was very far away. And so the signal that you would receive in England was very staticky, it wasn't very good quality, and it was only really on late at night. But this gave Ronan O'Reilly an idea.
I mean, I never set off to make money to start with. I mean, we set off to break artists, to give unknown artists an opportunity to be heard.
I like this guy, Ronan O'Reilly. O'Reilly.
He was a nightclub promoter and also a manager of musicians. And he had this one artist by the name of Georgie Fame. And after Ronan O'Reilly was trying to break George onto the scene, when he tried to get Georgie Fame onto the BBC, he found out that they won't play records unless they're signed to a major label, being EMI and Decca. And then when he went over to Radio Luxembourg to get it played, he found out that they were actually owned by EMI and Decca, and the only way that you would get your record on that station is if you paid for it to be played there. And so Ronan O'Reilly decided he wanted to change things. But look, here's the situation. The BBC have a complete monopoly. They're the only people that are allowed to do radio, by law. But there was a loophole. International waters.
Nice.
In maritime law, it's generally recognized that every country has like a radius, whereby their laws apply. But beyond that radius, you're in international waters. And so if you and the boys wanted to get in a dinghy, travel out to sea, play some bangers off of a massive antenna back into the UK, you could, in theory, break the BBC's monopoly and fundamentally overturn British culture. And so Radio Caroline would start on the 28th of May, 1964.
This is Radio Caroline on 199 meters, your all-day music station, Britain's first commercial radio station.
I'm sorry, wait, what day?
Radio Caroline would start on the 28th of May, 1964.
May 28th, 1964. I'm just curious, what else happened that day? The number one song was Love Me Do by the Beatles in the United States. The number one song in the UK was You're My World by Cilla Black. The most popular movie at the time was The Night of the Iguana by John Huston. The unmanned Apollo 2 Saturn rocket test launched into Earth's orbit. The Palestine National Congress forms the Palestine Liberation Organization in Jerusalem.
This is Radio Caroline on 199 meters, your all-day music station, Britain's first commercial radio station. My name's Tom Lodge, your disc jockey for the next hour.
And very quickly, pirate radio spread. It got pretty out of control pretty quickly.
Look at this antenna, y'all. It's taller than the boat is long. Amazing.
More and more ships started to pop up. You had Radio London, Radio Atlanta. For you, the British public, this radio is unlike anything else you've ever heard. Instead of listening to some fucking Jeben talking about gardening techniques for 2 hours, now you could listen to these naughty boys saying things like drats or darn it. These British pirate radio stations weren't the first of its kind. The Dutch had done it, the Danes, the Swedes, and this had all really started to become a trend in the 60s, all of which were actually following the Australians and the Americans who had for a very long time commercial radio stations. They were allowed to do it, where they could play music and advertise the health benefits of smoking, and the BBC fundamentally hated this.
Oh, I bet.
Installation of Her Majesty's government has now allowed Radio Caroline to become established, is now allowing Radio Atlanta to start her test transmissions. An audience is being built up, and consequently the government are building up trouble for themselves.
There's someone you need to know who is very important in this story. And his name is Lord John Reeve, 1st Baron. And he was the general manager of the BBC. Johnny Boy had a very different idea of how radio should be run.
The BBC structure was based on the Church of Scotland.
The BBC became John's church, his pulpit, and he knew how to mesmerize people.
He was a big Christian. He was a big religious boy, and he felt that the radio was a vessel to uphold these traditional Christian values. He was quoted once that somebody introduced Christianity in England, and somebody introduced smallpox, bubonic plague, and the Black Death. And somebody is minded right now to introduce sponsored broadcasting. Which, you know, reading that in retrospect, it could be considered maybe a little bit dramatic. He, and I'm sure many other people, believed that commercialization would corrupt the radio away from putting out Christian values.
Well, I mean, in a way he was right. I gotta say, listening to the radio now, it's all advertisements mostly, and it's really annoying.
And so the BBC were in the market of like banning songs and censoring music. So what I'm trying to communicate is that the BBC was very highbrow, and it really catered for like this upper class, this sophisticated, reserved part of British society, who were probably pretty happy that the working classes had to pay taxes and license fees to kind of indulge their personal taste and culture. Lord Reeve, you know, just to get a feeling of Lord Reeve, he was also said to be an admirer of Mussolini and Hitler. So with all that understood, just imagine, you know, you're Damien, an average 1960s hippie in Britain, and you tuned into the BBC, you might realise that this isn't maybe your vibe. And so pirate radio was the alternative, it was the counter, and it started to really dominate. And so when the mainstream British establishment caught wind of pirate radio and saw the bros having some fun, they decided to put a stop to it.
Government may pronounce soon on the future of radio in Britain.
How, like, I'm curious to see how this pans out, because if they're in international waters, like, how, and on a boat, how could they find them? What laws were they breaking? I have many questions. We're only 11 minutes in.
Mr. Wedgwood Benn, the Postmaster General, has already pronounced on the pirates.
They're stealing the copyright and paying no money for it. They're playing records that musicians have recorded and giving them no money for it.
There was one man really tasked with trying to bring down the pirates. Tony Benn. He was a dick. He absolutely, I don't know why, but he...
Yeah, so this guy's pretending to speak for the artists.
He was a dick. He absolutely, I don't know why, but he absolutely hated pirate radio. And so he did this whole campaign trying to tarnish the reputation of these pirates. The claims were often exaggerated or just an outright lie, saying they broke copyright laws, and that they didn't pay artists, which wasn't true. But there was one accusation that stuck, and that was that pirate radio can affect emergency broadcast waves.
The real risk that distress at sea might not be reported because of the inadequate fumbling handling of equipment.
As far as I'm aware, the radio works that you have a band of frequencies, you pick one, you broadcast through it, and say like Bob the fisherman has fucked it, he got his boat bitten by a turtle, and so he needs to call out SOS to the emergency services. It was theoretically possible that he would put his signal out on the same frequency that a pirate radio station might be on. And therefore, the emergency services
Often does
would
that
never
happen?
receive his emergency cry. This was a pretty damning accusation because it did hold some truth. And
Really?
you could say that there was an obvious solution. Why don't we license these radio stations, give them a legal license, and let them go legit?
Yeah.
For some reason, they didn't do that, and it leaves you with the question.
They could have made a bunch of money.
I think a lot of the fear of...
They could have made a bunch of money. How much does a radio license cost now? $35. In the UK, £75 to £1,480. They could charge a lot more. They could charge 1,000 times more than that.
Why? I think a lot of the fear of radio really simply comes down to influence.
London's Hyde Park becomes a hippie festival as some 3,000 so-called flower children gather to preach love, peace, and legalized pot.
The mid-60s, Britain is seeing like a rise in this countercultural hippie movement. I think that the British establishment and the BBC were getting scared that if they didn't have the monopoly on culture that the BBC gave them, that they might lose control of the people. America had this radio station called Voice of America, and basically they broadcasted American propaganda into like Soviet nations, South America, etc. Radio was becoming a very influential tool in getting a message out. And so bear in mind, this is the Cold War period. This is like the Cuban Missile Crisis. So think about it. If you have this unlicensed radio station, there's no rules over who they advertise or what. And imagine Russia just went, hey bros, how about you say that we're actually really sick? You guys suck. Yeah? Hey, yeah. They could do that, and the British government would have no power to stop them. But here's the reality, is that Radio Caroline and the other pirate radios weren't political. They were just playing music. Like, sure, they were maybe a bit more edgy than the BBC, but they didn't want to be deep in controversy because they wanted the money from advertisers. And so we'd get about 3 good years of pirate radio, and then the pirates would shoot themselves in the foot, or I suppose more specifically, the chest.
We were going to the Rough Towers fort. We got there, it still appeared abandoned. We shouted and got no replies. We started to make efforts to get somebody onto the ladder, which was already hanging down, a rope ladder.
What is this?
Roy Bates, he saw the success of pirate radio and he wanted to make his own station called Radio Essex. And he spotted a disused military fort. So this wasn't a boat, this was like a military post called Knock John Fort. His plan was to go to this fort and set up a radio station and Bob's your uncle. However, operating very close by on Shivering Sands, which sounds like a Fortnite drop-in, there was another station called Radio City, and this was owned by Reg Calvert. Reg had also saw Knock John Fort, he wanted to take it, and he had already put £3,000 worth of equipment onto the fort. Roy Bates one day turned up with a big group of boys, saw a deserted fort with a load of equipment, and kind of just took it. Obviously, Reg Calvert was pissed, so he headed over to have, you know, a little man-to-man.
We got one man on when suddenly over the top a number of heavy gas cylinders were thrown at us, half a dozen Molotov cocktails,
oh my God,
glass bottles with petrol or paraffin in, which were alight.
This was a bit of a gift to the BBC and the establishment, as the press were talking about it, and it didn't really make pirate radios look very good. But then your boy Reg Calvert just couldn't keep his nose out of trouble. Another geezer called Major Oliver...
Hang on. Roy Bates. Oh, so Roy Bates established this place, and then Ronan O'Reilly? He's the guy who started... Wait, he attacked him? Radio Caroline, along with a small group of men, tried to storm the platform that Bates claimed. Bates and his associates used petrol to thwart O'Reilly's attempts. As a result of the conflict, the Royal Navy went to Ruff's Tower and were the recipients of warning shots fired by Bates's son Michael when they entered what Bates claimed to be Sealand's territorial waters. Bates and his son were arrested and charged in a British court with weapons charges. The court threw out the case, claiming that the British court did not have jurisdiction over international affairs, as Ruff's Tower lay beyond the international or the territorial waters of Britain.
Another geezer called Major Oliver Schmedley, who was on Radio Caroline, he was trying to get Reg Calvert to join radio stations, and the promise was that in return he would get some massive transmitter. The transmitter arrived, someone dropped it in the sea, and it didn't work anymore. Reg Calvert opened it, saw that it was fucked, and he went, well, I'm not paying for it. 20th of June, 1966, Oliver Schmedley got a big boatload of boys, headed over to Radio City and tried to retrieve the transmitter. And so the very next day, Oliver started to receive some pretty threatening phone calls from Reg Calvert.
Line Wednesday, June the 22nd, Essex. William Oliver Smedley has been charged with the murder of Reg Calvert, the head of Radio City, who was found dead in a house in Saffron Walden this morning. Smedley was remanded in custody for a fortnight. Mr. Calvert died from a gunshot wound in the chest.
Whoa.
This was a golden ticket for the BBC and the politicians who wanted to shut down pirate radio. They were trying to say it was criminal and they were dangerous, but in reality, the reason there were so many criminals involved was because they weren't giving them licenses, so it attracted the more questionable sorts. And so this would lead us to the Marine and Broadcasting Offences Act of 1967. This bill was sadly the death of the first wave of pirate radios. It basically made it so that it was a criminal offence for anyone in Britain to work with pirate radio stations. You know, whether that was selling them records, whether that was selling them transmitters, fucking supplying them a bacon butty, you could get in trouble yourself if you dealt with them. And so it made it pretty impossible for many of these radio stations to continue.
On what grounds? You can't just declare something illegal. The Act represented UK's ratification of the 1965 blah, 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 blah. At the time the bill was introduced in Parliament in 1966, there were radio stations and proposals for television stations outside British licensing jurisdiction with signals aimed at Britain. These stations were anchored at sea, but there were press reports of stations broadcasting from aircraft, Caroline TV, and from a ship, Radex TV. The Act was extended to the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man in September 1967. The Act meant that the operation of offshore pirate radio stations became illegal if they were operated or assisted by persons subject to UK law. Oh. So UK citizens couldn't do it. It prohibited carrying by water or air goods or persons to or from it, which made tendering illegal. Station operators thought they could continue if they were staffed, supplied, and funded by non-British citizens, but this largely proved impractical. Okay, so that clears it up. It was on the grounds that British citizens couldn't do it. I guess that makes
records,
sense.
whether that was selling them transmitters, fucking supplying them a bacon butty, you could get in trouble yourself if you dealt with them. And so it made it pretty impossible for many of these radio stations to continue. But you see, despite technically being killed by the BBC and the establishment, in a way, the pirates kind of won.
City poppers and finger poppers, we're gonna do the thing right here with the Emperor Roscoe on Caroline South. Emperor Roscoe the Governor.
The pirates changed music completely. Now, playing pop music all day long was the norm. They progressed some of the biggest artists of a generation. They themselves, in like a few years, effectively created an entire new industry. And the BBC just effectively said, cheers for that, lads. We'll take it from here.
The way I used the run-in time was, of course, to listen to the pirate stations, because pretty soon I realized that it was a case of taking the best of those people and putting them on the new channel, that they already had an audience which they would bring with them. If you want to make a religion successful, you build your church on the ruins of the previous religion.
And so BBC Radio 1 launched on the 30th of September 1967. What they did was smart. Instead of trying to completely suppress this hippie revolution, they instead decided to give the hippies what they want, but just under the loving parental guidance of our government. And you can see an example of this with the first song that Radio 1 ever played. It was called Flowers in the Rain by The Move. This song was number 2 in the top 20 records of that week. And you might wonder, why didn't they play the number 1 song? The number 1 song at the time was called The Last Waltz. But BBC Radio 1 didn't like the content of that song, and they decided it would be inappropriate for the ears of the younger generation. But alas, from here, the BBC radio stations, Radio Luxembourg, and actually Radio Caroline continued broadcasting. And
What are the lyrics to The Last Waltz by Engelbert Humperdinck? I wonder, should I go or should I stay? The band had only one more song to play, and then I saw you out the corner of my eye, a little girl, alone and shy. I had the last waltz with you, two lonely people together. I fell in love with you. The last waltz should last forever, but the love we had was going strong. Though the good and the bad would get along, and then the fame of love died in your eyes. My heart was broken, too, when you said goodbye. I had the last waltz with you. Blah, 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 blah. La, 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 la. Maybe they're talking about I don't know.
Radio Luxembourg, and actually Radio Caroline continued broadcast. And it gave the people what they kind of wanted. It might not have been exactly it, but for the most part, it filled the appetites of the British public when it came to music. And slowly from here in the 70s and the 80s, the establishment gave out more radio licenses, now to commercial stations. Just bear in mind that America had had commercial radio since the 20s, and we are now getting it in the 70s, so just to give you perspective. And so this was the nature of radio for many years. Like, a few more stations would come along, BBC Radio 1 would adapt and evolve, while still keeping dominance over the airwaves. That was until the 80s.
Okay.
Pick any night in London in the mid-1980s and you'll find something strange going on. The rooftops were bustling with a new kind of criminal activity.
Over time, there's a lot more immigration into England, and many of the black Caribbean community had moved to London. And slowly, the same situation that was happening all the way back in the 60s was starting to happen again with these immigrants in the 80s. The sort of black youth were typically listening to soul, reggae, and a bit later hip-hop, and they couldn't find any of this on like mainstream radio. You would never hear it on BBC. But it'd be soul music in particular that was actually starting to gain traction even amongst the white youth. And so ever so slowly, across the rooftops of London council estates, you would start to see these makeshift antennas just popping up everywhere. And this would spark the second wave of pirate radio.
Awesome.
All right, there's something you gotta understand about this.
That's highly illegal, right? They're just going to the rooftop? Like, they weren't even trying to do it legally.
All right, there's something you got to understand about this period of time in British culture. In the 80s, a lot of white Britain didn't really love black people.
Okay.
And so they often weren't allowed to go to clubs. Their music was seen as like lesser or lower class. There was basically like no black people allowed on the radio. But all the while, soul music was starting to gain some...
Yo, did you see the spin on this guy? I know we're talking about some serious stuff, but I just want to see him twist around again.
There was basically like no black people allowed on the radio. But all the while, soul music was starting to gain some popularity. And there would be this strange period of time where clubs would play soul music made by black people, but black people weren't allowed to go into the club to listen to it and dance.
They wanted the black without the blackness.
That's so messed
There's one occasion that springs to mind, my 21st birthday.
It's in the
for a
80s.
well-known jazz funk club, getting knocked back at the door, and that night was revelation time to me. I said, this is the last time anybody will ever tell me, this is not your night tonight, mate. It's not your music.
As early as 1970s, you had a station called Radio Invicta, which was broadcasted from the top of a London tower block. But this trend of like tower block radio stations started to really get popular in the 80s. And that's because the price of like transmitters was dropping. It was getting cheaper, more affordable to do. And you could pretty much broadcast a 40-mile radius off the top of a 15-story tower block. And so a group of...
40 miles. That's a lot farther than I thought. I thought maybe like 5 blocks. 40 miles.
Much broadcast a 40-mile radius off the top of a 15-story tower block. And so a group would come along called the Dread Broadcasting Corporation, also known as the DBC. This was Britain's first ever black music pirate radio station. And so in 1983, London weekday radio would start broadcasting. And this is where, interestingly, Tim Westwood would start his career as a DJ. And they had like a big list of DJs who would go on to be very famous. And they would be playing like soul, funk, jazz music, reggae, hip-hop, and even this cool new genre of music called house.
You got Indian, you got Greeks, you got blacks, and but the BBC and Capital and LBC can't cater for these communities. They can't do.
So in order to make that point, you're prepared to break the law and run an illegal station?
We have to.
Even if it means paying huge fines or possibly
going to prison.
But what was starting to happen was that by 1987, the Evening Standard's Readers Poll placed the illegal Kiss FM in second place behind the legal Capital Radio and ahead of BBC Radio 1. And so, obviously, something needed to be done again.
Last week, for the 15th time in 4 years...
Is it still around? Kiss FM. The station started in 1985 as a pirate radio station, Kiss FM, before becoming the UK's first legal black and dance music specialist radio station in 1990. 1990? Wow. This is reminding me that the first black artist to play on MTV was Michael Jackson, which is crazy. It's so crazy that our music is divided by race, or it used to be, you know? It's so weird. It started in South London, 1990. Okay, I think I'm reading ahead of the video.
Ahead of BBC Radio 1. And so, obviously something needed to be done again.
Last week, for the 15th time in 4 years, investigators monitoring equipment members of the 15th time in 4 years, DBC's transmitter was seized by members of the 270-strong Radio Investigation Service. Investigators monitoring equipment has already detected no fewer than 73 illegal land base stations broadcasting in Britain this year.
And so you might be thinking, this new pirate radio thing, this happened 20 years ago. Surely the establishment has learned from its mistakes. Just give them licenses.
Right.
No. In this era, this is like a really dramatic period of time. In 1981, there was the Brixton riots, and a lot of this had to do with race relations. This was an era of very big racial divides. And after that riot happened, for the BBC, the establishment, the idea of allowing black people just to speak their mind, that was scary.
Brixton riots. Hang on, I got a series of clashes between mainly black youths and the Metropolitan Police in Brixton between April 10th and 12th resulted from racial discrimination against the black community by its mainly white police, especially the police's increased use of stop and search in the area, and ongoing tensions resulting from deaths of 13 black teenagers and young adults in the suspicious New Cross house fire that January. The main riot on 11th of April, dubbed Bloody Saturday by Time magazine, resulted in 279 injuries to police and 45 injuries to members of the public. Over 100 vehicles were burned, including 56 police vehicles. Almost 150 buildings were damaged, 30 of which were burnt out, and many shops were looted. Reports suggested that up to 5,000 people were involved. The Thatcher government commissioned an inquiry which resulted in the Scarman Report. Wow, in the 80s, it's like you would think... Yeah, like he's saying, seems like they would have learned their lesson from the first time in the 60s. Wow, it's crazy, too, to think about race in the UK is it's on a different path than in the United States. It's not better or worse, it's just different, People think about it differently, I think. At around 5:15 p.m., a police constable spotted a black youth named Michael Bailey running towards him, apparently away from 3 other black youths. Bailey was stopped and found to be badly bleeding, but broke away from the constable. Stopped again on Atlantic Road, Bailey was found to have a 4-inch stab wound. He ran into a flat and was helped by a family and the police constable there by putting kitchen roll on his wound. A crowd gathered, and as the police tried to take the wounded boy to a waiting minicab on Railton Road, the crowd tried to intervene, thinking the police did not appear to be providing or seeking the medical help Bailey needed quickly enough. As the minicab pulled away at the speed, a police car arrived and stopped the cab. When an officer from the police car realized Bailey was wounded, he moved him to and bound his wound more tightly to stop the bleeding. A group of 50 youths began to shout for Bailey's release, thinking the police were arresting him. These cops were trying to help this kid who'd been stabbed, but just because of the way it was playing out with the moving from the car, blah, 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 they thought they were arresting him and letting him die. But it wasn't. It was a misunderstanding. Damn.
Despite, again, the fact that many of these stations were not political and they just wanted to play music, but the BBC didn't see it like that. This all happened in this weirdly contradictory era of Thatcherism. The Thatcher era was basically telling everyone, go out and make a business, sell stuff, make money. So when a young
radio
group of black
station.
lads wanted to, play reggae music, managing to create audiences of millions, invest in their own time, their own effort, money into making these stations, advancing technology, advancing music, the Thatcher government took a look at them and said, yeah, not that kind of business.
There's no way JBC's here to stay on the big frequency of 105 FM.
Raid. It's a raid.
Get the camera. Get the camera ready. We're on the raid now.
They're raiding now.
The stereo.
The government
Oh my
agency
God.
called the DTI were tasked with shutting down the pirates. And it was pretty much a cat and mouse between the pirates and DTI. They'd make all these claims about the pirates, they'd connect them to criminal networks, say that all it was a front for advertising raves that sold drugs. But the problem is the DTI's ability to go and shut down these stations physically was kind of limited by the invention of the microwave. They weren't just microwaving Rustler's burgers and throwing them at the police, but rather this frequency allowed pirate radio stations to kind of make their shows separate to the transmitters and then, I don't know, fucking ding it out through a microwave or something. What this meant was that they didn't need to be located right next to the transmitter. They could actually have 20 transmitters all around different tower blocks, and if one gets shut down, you just ping it over to another one. And so the pirates would make it very hard for the DTI to even access the rooftops that they had the antennas on, and it became this game of cat and mouse.
Off comes on the attack again. Another raid and another illegal station's about to go.
By 1985, it had become so unfeasible for the DTI to attack the pirate radio stations that eventually they decided to give in. And they made a deal with the pirate stations. They said, guys, we will give you this lovely license that you've always wanted as long as you agree to cease broadcasting and come off the radio.
We did everything expected of us.
Wait,
we spent a phenomenal...
You can have a radio license if you stop broadcasting radio? Well, that doesn't make sense.
We did everything expected of us. We spent a phenomenal amount of money putting the application together. Just for PR alone, we spent £30,000.
And then, without any explanation, the government pulled the plug.
This afternoon's announcement by the Home Secretary, Mr. Douglas Hurd, that plans for community radio are to be put on ice.
The government rug pulled them. It's tough, but it's true. But this U-turn that the government made on not giving out the licenses was a fucking big mistake. Now, the airwaves were completely open again. All the big stations were off, so now it was like this mad rush to try and take over the airwaves. Desperately, the DTI were now able to, like, seize records and confiscate them, but none of it really did anything. The pirate radio stations got so big that they were taking market share away from these licensed stations and even taking their advertisers. The DTI went on an even bigger smear campaign, saying that the pirate radio stations were now beating up their inspectors, and there was claims that one died of a heart attack after being attacked. And I don't know how true this was. I think probably it did happen to some degree. There was a book published called Radio My Bomb, and this was like a book that gave you information on how to set up your own radio station. And within that book, it does specifically explain how to beat up and attack DTI officers.
Oh no. Oh no. Y'all, this makes me want to start a radio station.
Yeah, like these guys might be dicks, but at the end of the day, they're just doing a fucking job. But again, you have to ask, why was all of this happening? Yeah, you can point fingers at the people doing this shit is bad, of course. But ultimately, the reason it was happening was because the government pushed it into criminality and then was surprised when criminals appeared there. And so again, in 1988, the government decided, okay, we will give out some more fucking licenses. Just please stop.
From all of us at KISS, until we meet again, goodbye, God bless, and thank you.
We do 1989 off air, and they're about to announce the license.
Then it turned out the DTI fucked us over. I'm like, see what I mean?
Oh, Jazz FM got it. Told ya!
Felt like a bit of an establishment stitch-up.
July 12, 1989, the IBA instead awarded the license to Jazz FM, of course.
Because they were extremely well backed by people with a lot of clout.
For some reason, they fell for the trap, and the government rug pulled them twice.
But KISS held out.
The radio authority said, don't go back on air. Just do not go back on air. We're going to talk to the powers that be and see if we can get some more licenses. We put the application in, and in December, we found out we'd won the licence.
I'd just like to get something out of my system altogether.
We're on air!
Okay,
Here's the
that's
thing.
a
Although the government were now starting to give out some more licenses, they weren't exactly putting out. They were very prudish in giving them out, despite all the clear evidence that pirate radio stations were the ones evolving music. And it was so clear by the 90s with the rise of house music, garage, drum and bass, jungle, all coming from the pirate scene. For some reason, they could see their influence that had always existed, and they were just choosing to not play that kind of music on mainstream radio, despite a clear demand for it. And it seems that all of this comes from this like recurring theme that our government has a very paternalistic attitude when it comes to stuff like this. They believe they know best. So just imagine when grime music starts to appear.
Oh god. Those old white guys are gonna freak the hell out when they hear grime.
And my hair gets knotty.
Can you imagine?
It's like they're not going to allow reggae and soul music on the radio. Imagine what they thought of grime. And it's mad because the grime scene, which came directly off the 90s, the 2000s underground pirate radio scene, it took about 15 or so years before it got the attention it really deserved. Despite every single effort of the establishment to try and suppress grime.
Well, I'm sorry, what does that say?
Despite every...
Calls grow to scrap potentially racist Form 696 as music industry suffers.
Every single effort of the
Rahul Verma, a journalist specializing in urban music, said whole genres were under threat. It is very difficult to find a grime night in London now because of the use of this form. This is because it has been used to stereotype certain urban music events which are being unfairly associated with violence and trouble.
establishment to try and suppress grime. But then in this age-old tradition of British establishment, whilst they fought to suppress the pirates, simultaneously they allowed BBC to take this whole industry and profit from it.
This is one extra.
I mean, they should have been doing this before. Good profit from it, right?
Rinse FM, which was like one of the main pirate radios for grime, rap, all this kind of stuff, they remained illegal until 2010. 2010, it's not that long ago. But 8 years before that, in 2002, Radio 1 made Radio 1 Extra. This was a way to essentially funnel this new market, this new underground pirate scene created by the hard work of these grime pirate radio stations and just, sweep it in to the BBC's monopoly, just like they did in the 60s.
Yeah. Like One Extra, in some respects, has kind of taken...
For sure.
It's killed the pirate radio.
I imagine for the creators of pirate radio, it must be very bittersweet when they look at things like the BBC and the establishment. On one hand, many of what those DJs and what the musicians did completely changed mainstream culture and influenced how people interact with music and the things that we like to this day. On the other hand, they must feel like they did all of the heavy lifting. They literally created these genres and the style of radio, these elaborate networks of artists, etc. Only for the BBC to fight them, suppress them, make them illegal,
and then take
on top
it.
Of that, just they were always looked down upon. And don't get me wrong, I really do enjoy the BBC. I think Radio 1's great, but there is a part of me that really finds it hard not to just see it as like a state-run monopoly that seems to historically control the expression of the general public. So I can imagine for a lot of these artists, DJs, and people involved in pirate radio, there's probably a mix of feeling thankful but also very resentful towards the establishment. So with that, all I can really say is this one goes out to the pirate crew.
Wow. Y'all, this is crazy. I didn't know it was such a thing. And it's only recently, really, kind of smoothed out. Crazy. I want to start a radio station. I guess it wouldn't really, we got the internet now. No one listens to the radio. Unless you're in your car and your phone died or something. Right? This is fascinating. I didn't expect the racial component. It was unexpected, but now I'm not surprised, though, Y'all be sure to go to Jimmy the Giant and like and subscribe. And if you made it this far in the video, give me a like and subscribe. What's up? I'd like to thank my patrons. I'd like to thank my Buy Me Coffee people. Thank y'all for watching this with me, and I'll see you next time. Later. Start a radio station.